Today, we're going to be speaking with Tomas Avila Carrasco, who completed his doctoral dissertation in Chicana and Chicano Studies. His dissertation is titled Oppositional Performance, a Social Historical Analysis of the Avant-Garde Comedy Troupe, the Chicano Secret Service. He's not only an academic who's at the chair of American Ethnic Studies at his home college, he's also a well-known performer in that same comedy troupe, the Chicano Secret Service. And finally, the viewer should know that he is speaking to a group of about 5 graduate students and myself, Michael Trujillo. We're reading this dissertation not only for its contents, but also as an example of how to write a dissertation. Dr. Carrasco completed his dissertation in an honest-to-God Chicano and Chicano Studies department at UC Santa Barbara in 2012. His advisors, his co-chairs, were Mario T. Garcia and George Lipsitz, both of them extraordinarily important figures. And I'm going to go ahead and read some of that abstract for that dissertation. This dissertation documents, describes, and analyzes the emergence and elaboration of cultural expressions produced by the comedy troupe Chicano Secret Service from 1988 to the present. As part of the Chicano radical performance tradition, the performance of CSS imagined and created a culture of liberation and emancipation through Chicana political satire. The sketch comedy troupe's response to the neoliberal racial capitalist moment of the 1980s to the present articulated what I describe as oppositional performance. The dissertation argues that instances of oppositional performance emanate from within the contested historical context between the dominant neoliberal bloc and the emergent Chicano art performance bloc. Utilizing the interdisciplinary research methods of Chicana and Chicano cultural studies and incorporating performance studies, media studies, history, and sociology. I'll leave it there. I think that will introduce people who may be watching this at a later time who haven't looked at the dissertation. So with this, I hand it over to Dr. Carrasco.
Michael, thank you for having me here. I'm excited for all of you. I'm going to sound really dorky, but one of the things I want to start off with is that you need to enjoy writing this dissertation. I always push students. We're very, very privileged to be where we're at, in regards to sitting down and studying. If you look at the history of the world, who was able to just study? And so I think it's a great privilege to have. My name is Tomas Avila Carrasco. I'm born and raised in Oxnard, California. It's like an hour north of LA and about 30 minutes south of Santa Barbara. I'm a working class Chicano that comes from a trucking family. I was very, very influenced by my grandma, who was born in 1922 in East LA. I was born and raised in Oxnard. I went to San Diego State, got a bachelor's in political science, Chicano studies. Then I went to Berkeley and San Francisco State, and I got a master's in ethnic studies. Then I became a performer. We started a comedy troupe called Chicano Secret Service. I'm not famous and I'm not rich, but I've almost performed at every single university, definitely in the Southwest. You guys probably have heard of Culture Clash and John Leguizamo. We've always thrived on being smart. I don't want to call it intellectual comedy, but definitely intellectual / rascuache. And we just made our mark. I got to work with Culture Clash and John Leguizamo. And then I hit about 35, 36, and being from a working class family, my parents were always like, and my grandparents were always like, you need to get excuse my language, but you need to get a pinchy job, artists for rich people. And then actually got into performance studies, but you have to go with your gut. And so I got into Northwestern Performance Studies, but I was a first cohort in Chicano Studies at UC Santa Barbara. So I almost call it like a blue collar PhD. I worked all through my PhD. The more I worked, the better I did. The more money I had, the less productive I was. So just so you know, I don't know where you all are at, but once you become AD, I got a ton of money. I got all these grants and I didn't do anything. So anyway, the less money I had, the more productive I was. Just preparing for you all, I was like, man, this just is a lot. So generally speaking, I wanted to start off with George Lipsitz was amazing. I knew George as I was a performer, so I'd actually met him at UC San Diego and in the streets of LA. And so he was always really, really cool with me. And he trained me as a scholar. And again, I really didn't know what I was getting into when I started this PhD. I was working part-time at Cal State LA. And again, as a working class Chicano, I was like, man, I'm never going to become a full-time professor without a PhD. And so then, everything's timing. So I went for it. It was the hardest thing I ever did, but it was the best thing I ever did. And then I remember it was landmark when George Lipsitz told me, you are here to create original forms of knowledge. Straight up, period, right? You are here to create original forms of knowledge, whatever that means to you. And so I had this illustrious career I went from UC Berkeley to downtown LA in 1992. There was a riot. There was a major, again, like it was a demographic shift going on as it's going on right now. There's like 6 million Mexicans in LA. The traffic wasn't that bad back then, and I was able to have these amazing apartments. I led a really good life. I was teaching at Cal State LA on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then I would sub at LA Unified on Friday and Monday, and I was traveling all over the country. That being said, I got into UCSB, and then I just started, again, I was very goal oriented. First 2 years, I did all my coursework, but every single paper that I wrote, it went towards my dissertation. I was an older student, so George Lipsitz was very, very strategic. So the first paper I wrote was Troy Cafe, and it was a site that we used to perform a lot. And then from there, I just started. Mario Garcia thought it was amazing that I got the idea to do a dissertation on Chicano Sigue Service, the comedy troupe that I was in. So again, my main method was ethnography and primary sources and secondary sources. I did interviews. Again, we could talk about observant participation real quick. I want to promote. There's a really cool book called Catching Hell in the City of Angels by Joe Vargas. And so he was an observant participant. Sorry if I segue, like I come from a big family, so I have like 5 conversations going on at one time. But anyways, I'm going back to this. My method was ethnography, and I took this really great course called critical ethnography, right? So again, my whole method was document, describe, and analyze. And analyzing is the key, because a lot of people will just document and describe, but within Chicano studies, that's that critical analysis, is to analyze, right? So again, I did interviews, I analyzed videos, newspaper articles, scripts, posters, and then I started to develop, I'll say it, man, I was like at the Chicano Harvard. I was studying with Chela Sandoval, with Cedric Robinson, with Clyde Woods, Avery Gordon, Kumkum Bavnar. Then I went up to Berkeley.
I'm just going to mention to everyone that Sheila Sandoval's from New Mexico.
Yeah.
She has connections to Cañones right by Abiquiu.
Right on, right on. And we're from Socorro. My dad's from El Paso, and my grandma was from East LA. So when she married my grandpa, he took her back there, and my grandma was like this kind of a modern Mexican American. Life in El Paso, my grandma was like, oh, hell no. So we always thank my grandma for taking us back to California, because I'm never going to leave California. But anyways, yeah, she was very influential, that aesthetic, that East LA aesthetic, that stance. I did my first ethnography on her, and her and my grandpa had a truck, and then they saved up for a second truck, and she worked like a man for 2 years. And then she was one of the first women that wore pants in Oxnard, and she wanted to buy a house. And so she couldn't buy it in the white area, so she bought it in the Black and Chicano area. And just like Chicano neighborhood, across the street was a bar. And so every time we'd leave, she would bless us, and she would say, be ready. And we would say, be ready for what, Grandma? Be ready for everything. Be ready. And I was like, oh my God, right? But that is a very good philosophy. Be ready. People are crazy. But going back to this dissertation, I did an observant participant method where I was part of the study. And again, I was really influenced by Cedric Robinson and the Black radical tradition. So then I started to, rethink. And so I pushed the Chicano radical performance tradition, right? And then very, very similar, subverting white supremacy ideology, colonialism, and trying to create a world that we wish would exist, even if it was just for a moment, right? So again, the other person that I was really, really influenced by was Damien Baca. And I do this whole thing when I teach Chicano popular culture, Chicano rhetorics, So I feel like Damien Baca, he builds from Azaldúa, and this is Damien Baca to analyze how Mesoamerican and Western culture materials intersect and interact to produce new possibilities through a dynamic strategy of mestizo invention. And so that's why I do a lot on like to invent, right? And so one of my main things of when I was documenting Chicano Secret Service, I really wanted to, and I still do this right with capture that Mexican working class aesthetic, right? And so even though I'm a Chicano, and I say this when I'm in Mexico, like the reason why I call myself a Chicano is because I'm so proud to be a Mexican. And just generally speaking, I'm the product of the Chicano power movement, right? So I come from a family where my mom was segregated. She didn't have access to universities, to education. And then my generation, we did have access, right? And so I was born at the right time. But so again, I don't know why I did that. So again, that Chicano identity becomes very, very prevalent throughout this whole dissertation. And again, Chicano rhetorics, I love mestizo rhetorics because people usually think about rhetoric of just words, but I'm utilizing rhetoric as film, as poetry, as theater. And the argument is that we exist and we are human. I hate to say that, but pretty much that's the foundation of my work. And new inventions of Western and indigenous culture that create forms of Chicano knowledge, right? So, an example of Chicano knowledge that I teach and I create is that we are ancient and we are simultaneously modern. We are ancient and we are simultaneously modern, right? So, again, that's through all the knowledge and my lived experience that I have, and then trying to become a professor and a performer simultaneously. So again, our goal was to subvert and critique the cultural domination, and this is done by the Chicano radical performance tradition. Again, observant participation method. And again, so I don't know if this is American studies or Chicano studies, but I just love the concept of document, describe, and analyze. Document, describe, and analyze. Social conditions as cultural expressions being created, right? And so that's what I do throughout this dissertation, the research objects, right? Analyzing, investigating, and addressing political acto multimedia performances. And then I pulled out for y'all, why did these actors choose this mode of expression? So the concept of political satire, right? So political satire becomes very, very organic to my natural reaction as a human being and my natural reaction as a performer and my natural reaction as a scholar. As a Chicano, political satire, right? Mexicans are lazy, but they're going to take our jobs. Mexicans are dirty, but please clean my house. I really don't trust you, but could you take care of my children? That's not funny? Not funny? No, I'm just joking, y'all. Sorry about that. But I know it's effed up. But the most important part of those jokes is where I get them from. So like that one, I don't trust you, but could you take care of my children? I was at a park in LA and there was these two Mexicanas, and it was a hot day, man. And they had like these three little white kids and two dogs. And these two Mexicanas were talking papas about the ladies that they worked with, about how she didn't want to lend her car to drive to the dog park, but she trusted her with her kids. I just thought that was deep. So that's where I get my satire, through my lived experiences. So again, you can just see my face, but I'm 6'5" and I'm 300 pounds on a light week. I'm a giant Mexican. And so I was born into satire, right? And I used to tell George Lipset, some people are born into the debate team. Some people join the debate team. I was born in the debate team, right? So there's 5 of us. We all went to Berkeley and we get into it politically in my family. Just to give you more of a background. But why were these actions chosen of modes of expression? How were they successful? And why and how was CSS why we were so aggressive at the time, right? And again, so what I did, I was influenced by Clyde Wood's epistemology of the blues. So he would create, in his book, he created the blues block versus the plantation block, right? And so this is Gramsci. his concept of historical blocks. And one of the most powerful things that I learned from George Lipsitz is that historical blocks, right? Say Manifest Destiny is a historical block, right? Dominant, right? We're all immigrants, right? Within these historical blocks, if you stay within the dominant narrative, if you stay within that dominant narrative, no matter what, you are going to reproduce that dominant narrative. So the trick is to step outside into an interstitial space and critique it. To step outside into an interstitial space and critique it. And a perfect example of that is Rudy Acuna occupied America, right? He's not even arguing about the frontier. No, he's stating, no, we were already there. Does that make sense to you all? If any of you have questions as I'm talking, please just interrupt me. So historical blocks. So then within my theories, right? So then I took his cue in regards to the blues as an unofficial history of African Americans in the South, Americo Paredes, how he utilized corridos as the unofficial history of Mexicans in South Texas, right? So that got me to thinking, that's how I started to develop my theory that our sketches were kind of like the unofficial history of Chicanos in Southern California. And so I created the neoliberal block, which is Hollywood, corporations, right wingers versus the Chicano art block. That was my theory in my dissertation. And I also take a historical and materialistic analysis as how a specific political satire project negotiated the crisis of a racialized neoliberal movement while articulating struggle for hegemony from below. And again, Chicano studies, I use the lens, analyze, and document, and to describe why this form of political satire at this time. Why this form of political satire at this time, right? So this was the early 1990s. And then also I pulled out for y'all the relationship between Troupes, cultural texts, and their historical conjuncture. And I have this whole thing on conjuncture. I really like the concept of conjuncture from Gramsci, where like all these different political events come together, historical, to create a access for new forms of knowledge and emancipation to take place. Conjuncture. And there are historical conjunctures that have Marxist / Gramscian lens. And then real quick, going back to Marxism, one of the major things I learned from Chela Sandoval was that within Marx, there's certain cultures, commodities of culture, right? There's certain cultures that are marketable in mainstream society, and there's certain cultures that are not. And developing material that have Chicanos as smart, good looking, in charge, positive, are not marketable in mass media, in US mass media. There's two images that are reproduced over and over and over, and that is the immigrant and the criminal. So when I say counter hegemonic, I'm countering that, right, with the positive. I'm not interested in replacing a negative stereotype with a positive stereotype. I'm interested in creating a world that I wish would exist. And then I get into a little bit the organic, intellectual, mestizo, intersecting and interacting to produce new possibilities through live cultures. That was our whole goal, was to produce new empowering cultures, right? And then I wanted to highlight this using interviews and archival research to tell the untold history of Chicano Secret Service and the community that made it possible. I have analyzed the relationship between the troops' cultural texts and their historical conjuncture through a Marxist Gramscian lens. Using CSS as an object of inquiry, this dissertation provides a historical and materialistic analysis of how specific political satire project negotiates the crisis of racial neoliberalism while articulating a struggle from below. And then also, you guys can look this up. I really like this concept. CSS was utilizing what Gramsci called a war of position. And so it really makes you analyze. If you're writing on performance or culture, CSS was utilizing what Gramsci called a war of position, and that they were subverting and undermining the legitimacy of ruling dominant ideology. Within this war of position, CSS's goal was to influence student and community members to be proud of their culture and to fight for public education, healthcare, affordable housing, and economic opportunities for the working class. Again, war position. We could talk about that a little bit later. I also pulled this out for y'all. Influenced by Gramsci, Woods develops categories such as the plantation bloc versus the blues bloc to discuss how cultural, economic, and political practices of the dominant and subordinate create alliances and allegiances to influence the historical bloc. I use his theory to help develop what I call the neoliberal bloc versus the Chicano art bloc, and I talked about that a little bit later. Then in closing, I just pulled out specific cultural practices of performance like those produced by mainstream narratives, and by contrast, CSS are often subject to multiple readings. Stuart Hall suggests there are three possible ways to read a hegemonic text: a dominant reading that confirms to the intentions to reinforce existing power relations, an oppositional reading that critiques those in power relations, and a negotiated reading that confirms with some parts of the narrative and resists the other. So that's pretty much what I had pulled out for you all. Thank you for having me. And the last thing I wanted to say was again, I was trying to provide a lot of the insight that I wanted to get you. So when I used to have my meetings with George, he used to say, we're all full of contradictions, right? So now that I got my job, I'm a middle-class Chicano, So again, we all have contradictions, whether it was like going to UC Berkeley and then coming back into LA and not joining the middle class, but becoming a performer, right? Contradictions. And we have different issues of contradictions, but then he would always say, but why do contradictions count? And he would just every meeting I had with him, I would just be blown away. And then the last thing I'll tell you all is, one of the things that I was doing when I was getting my PhD, I just took in knowledge. And I learned a lot by going to conferences and just listening to people present their information. And then I literally went to the library every day for 2 years and I wrote like 357 pages. And so that's how I wrote my dissertation. We all have our own trajectories, right? But that's how I wrote it. And yeah, why do contradictions count? And again, creating original forms of knowledge to help our communities. So I'll leave it at that. I hope that's okay. Did I cover what you wanted me to do?
That was beautiful. And I'll ask you a couple of questions and then turn it over to the students. So first, I want to find out if my perception is correct. You were a member of the Chicano Secret Service before you entered graduate school, right?
Yeah. So just so you know, I had this amazing life. I was like, it was so funny, so I live an hour from LA, right? And so my whole life, like East LA Chicanos are always the coolest of all cool in LA, right? So when I went into LA, it was just, it was an amazing life being a performer, but my philosophies are like, there's certain things you do in your 20s, there's certain things you do in your 30s. And I did not want to be in my 50s and my 60s, like me, hire me. So I strategically shifted into actually a good friend had a master. He goes, have you ever teaching Chicano studies? I go, no. And so he hired me, and teaching is a performance. I had this also written down for you all, and this is from George. Teaching, research, and community will get you a full-time tenure track job. Teaching, research, and community. And I'll leave it at there because I know you guys are all in the process of getting the PhD. And I just really want to say that, man, I love my life. I love being a Chicano studies professor. I literally teach like at the Harvard of community colleges. Santa Barbara City College is a badass community college. And the best part of that school is that 40% of the students are Mexican. And I have 190 students a semester. And it is what it is. I'm a teaching fool, but I love it. So just so you know, it's worth getting your PhD. And most importantly, I wish you all the best. And yeah, I'll let you go ahead, Michael. I'm done.
No, that's beautiful. And it's good to remind everyone as they're going through this stuff and we're all facing obstacles, right? That there's this place to go, that you're going someplace. And thank you for that. So I think in terms of these things,
Okay.
You started here because you wanted to think about this experience that you had with the Chicano Secret Service, and that's how you
Yeah.
entered into this. And you had questions about that and evidence, and then probably the theory, which serves it really well, came later, as and the specifics of methods. But they were all hooked into this. Uh,
Definitely.
and then the question I was going to ask, and you can tell me if I'm wrong there too, but the question, and this relates, how did the dissertation itself, how much does it look like what you planned when you wrote your prospectus?
Very similar. I had ethnography, and I was grounded in Marx. Again, that commodity of culture, that concept was really the foundation of my critiquing the dominant culture. But it was pretty much a guideline. My perspectives was a guideline, and we worked on it a lot. There was different, one of my major methods was ethnography. And I took my cues from the scholars of cultural studies, that the intellectuals that got kicked out of Germany and went to Columbia, right? And so I was really grounded in the concept of hegemony. And just the way I teach hegemony is, this is my definition of hegemony. When the elites convince the masses that the elites' interests are the masses' interests through coercion and consent. When the elites convince the masses that the elites' interests are the masses' interests, and they do that through coercion and consent. So at a community college, I'm always like, I teach concepts, so that's how I teach hegemony, and then go into more depth. And then neoliberalism, I reduce, what's his name? David Harvey. Yeah, so all his books on this theory, I reduced them to neoliberalism is individualistic, competitive, and anti-community. That's how I teach my students what neoliberalism is. But anyway, so yeah, that's a side note there. So
Well, and just for anybody who's looking at this in the future, as well as the people here, we've just seen a reference to, we've seen Western Marxism, and we've got Gramsci. I imagine people like Lukács are in this overall frame. And then the Frankfurt School, those were the people that were rooted
yeah,
in Germany. And then we clearly see bicultural studies, we see a reference to Birmingham, right? The Birmingham
yeah,
School. And
definitely. That was my fault. And so a lot of times where I was studying, like the Frankfurt School of Popular Culture, I was like, oh my God, like I would apply it to Chicanos in the Southwest, right? Or even Edward Said in regards to fictive knowledge, what they did to the, Orientalism. I would apply that to the Southwest, the whole concept of it being barren land and nobody was there, right? And then creating this fictive knowledge, right? So anyway, so I was always utilizing theory intermixed with my lived experience to make sense of it, if that makes sense to y'all.
Colton, Hannah, Joseph, and Jewel, please ask questions.
If I can ask first, thank you for this presentation. It was very interesting, and I loved the dissertation. So this was written in 2012, and you're working towards producing a book out of it, and you are historicizing the tradition of protest theater, Chicano protest theater, in comparison to specific political points in time. And you're saying that satire is used to make light of this neoliberal domination, to rethink it and stuff. So I've just been thinking about how the dominant narrative now with social media and the Trump age is satire. It is unserious. And I was just wondering, what is the natural reaction to that in the Trump age with social media? And is satire effective in this day and age, I guess? And are we looking at maybe a return to like a war of maneuver that's just necessary given our political situation?
I don't know if Trump could be considered as satire to his following, first of all, right? Because he's not joking around. He may be crazy, but it's not satirical. He's serious in regards to just him being a success, him, just the white supremacy ideology that comes out of his, to me, that's not satirical at all. But
I'm thinking of the memes, I think. So
okay,
the recent one with the Obamas and how all of these departments are posting
yeah.
AI generated memes.
You know, I think what the hardest thing to do, right? Our biggest challenge is what is knowledge and what is not knowledge, right? What is truth and what is not truth? Generally speaking, with social media, that's where my natural reaction goes. I don't know if I'm misinterpreting it, so it's just unbelievable, right? Or even where I'm at right now, like where I live, we're fighting to be human beings. What they're doing to, I mean, to have 700 children in jail, for Texas to be writing a law where they can incarcerate children, that even like I'm going to be doing a conference on April 24th, and it's I'm claiming a Chicano Renaissance. So this is the other part of what I've been evolving into doing is I've been curating art shows and conferences. So I'm claiming a Chicano Renaissance in the early 1990s. So like when I entered that conversation in 1992, man, there was just like Otsumatli, Blues Experiment, Yeska, I mean, like Lisa Flores, I mean, like 20 Chicano bands, Culture Class, Chicano Secret Service, Chusma, LATC. And there was like an explosion of Chicano culture in the early 1990s. And so that's also what I'm documenting. So this is part of like a hidden history.
Well, I'm just thinking of like this idea of the war of like position versus maneuver. And
Yeah.
yeah, are we at a point where we have to shift to a war of maneuver again?
Yeah. And even like, to be honest with you, there's been a few retrospectives. There was this one art show that I wasn't part of, but it was revolutionary something. I forgot what it was, but it was the Magonistas, Osco, and then you analyze yourself, right? I was just like, well, were we revolutionary? And I'm analyzing Chicano Secret Service. And I got to be really honest with you. I don't really feel like I was revolutionary. I wasn't going to go burn down the banks and kill people, but I definitely wanted housing, education, healthcare, and access. So again, that's when you're analyzing yourself. Again, observant participation, right? And so, but those are two good concepts to really, really be able to master and then utilize for your own work, what you're doing. What's your work on, Colton? What are you studying?
Bandits and cyborgs, trying
Okay,
to work them out and put them together.
interesting. Right on, man. That's interesting.
I'll go next. I'm Jewel. So I just came from the Southwest Popular American Culture Conference, and I'm focusing on women in Texas, Chicanas in Texas, musicians, specifically accordionists. So I just came from the Southwest Popular American Culture Conference, and I noticed that there was this big trend. This is my second time presenting there. And there is a big trend on Taylor Swift studies, and they called it Swifty studies. And I left there yesterday thinking, do we have that in Chicano studies, like a Selenidad studies or something like that? But I think what you're describing is a lot like that. Like our Chicano form of Swifty studies would be like, like the performance studies and all the groups that came up when you were writing your dissertation.
What I'm really interested in is the historical moment that's being produced at that time. And who is it empower? Is it hegemonic or is it counter hegemonic? You know what I mean? And so I think what's really interesting to me is that where you'll see filmmakers or poets or whatever, they're reproducing what they're fighting against in regards to, say, stereotypes or just over sexualizing Latinas, et cetera, et cetera. But to be honest with you, I try to ignore the mainstream as best as possible. Even if you look at Selena, right? A lot of people have worked on Selena. There's so many hidden histories. Right now in LA, there's a lot of bands, rock en español, mixing rap and rock, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the coolest things that I always say when I lecture is I was at San Diego State from 85 to 90, and I always felt like Chicana feminism, it took Chicano studies to the next level in regards to A Bridge Called My Back, Ana Castillo, Cherie Moraga, and then as it keeps on evolving. So I think that Maria Lugones, I don't know if you read her, she's like a philosopher. She's really, really good. There's a few other ones that, yeah, I would just try to, again, going back, I learned so much going to conferences and just listening, right? And then whatever books I would read, chapter 1 is always a theory. I was writing my dissertation, Yolanda Boyes de Gonzalez, she wrote this amazing book. You should read it. It's called Teatro Campesino, and she theorizes on the Mexican working class. And it's amazing, right? So during my dissertation, I was citing her a lot. And I told George, I go, I'm citing her so much. He's like, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. And so if you see somebody that is writing very similar, don't worry. I'll use the word mimic, whatever you want to use, but like Clyde Woods, like I got to know him, and man, his book was amazing. That was exactly what I was trying to do with Chicano theater and performance in LA, right? And so did I answer your question or?
Yes, thank you.
Okay,
So
all right,
I'm
cool.
doing basically what you're doing, but the current times in Texas, South Texas.
Awesome. So again, look up conjuncture, Gramsci's concept of conjuncture. And then again, like what is hegemonic and what is counter-hegemonic? And the other thing that a lot of people miss, there's a lot of space between hegemony and counter-hegemonic. You know what I mean? And that's a space that scholars need to write about, whatever that means to you.
I'm going to prompt for Hannah, and then I'm going to have Joseph finish, and maybe you'll be the last one. So you'll get the last word, but go for it. Go for it, Anna.
So my question isn't necessarily directly about dissertation, but it's more so if you could give yourself or us advice as we work through this process of this PhD and dissertation. I know you already gave us really good feedback about enjoy it, but what other, I guess, motivation or advice would you give to someone who's not yet near comps, but also planning for that dissertation?
I would say read, take as much knowledge as you can in, and try to get somebody that's going to train you as a scholar. Even if it's a professor on campus, or it could be somebody else. And again, I would really say to go to as many conferences as you can and just listen to people. I love that concept. Sometimes it's just good to listen. But anyways, that, and then also to be really, you gotta go from the inside out. Like whatever you choose to study, you gotta be passionate about it. And again, whether it's a hidden history or whether it's emancipating people, like in Chicano studies, we create new forms of knowledge, generally speaking, to solve problems in a nutshell, right? Whether it's to subvert negative images or to whatever it is. But I was very goal orientated. So I was like, okay, I'm going to be done with all my coursework, right? And then after the coursework, I was just like prospectus. And the other thing too is being able to know when your brain works the best, right? So I would write from 7 to 11 in the morning, and then in the afternoon, I would just do emails and crap like that. And then the other thing too is that when you're writing the dissertation, this really helped me out a lot. So sometimes you get so overwhelmed, right? It's such a huge task. And George would literally say, I'd go real small, just focus in on one little element that you're writing about, and then you step back. And I also love the concept, sometimes you just got to let it stew. Like there'd be some days where I would write nothing. I'd be in the library for 2 hours and write nothing. And then for some reason, somehow the next day, I'd write 11 pages. And so I wasn't a very good typer. So I would literally get my 11 pages, and my aunt, she typed 90 minutes a word, right? And I would read to her and she would type it out for me. And then I'd go back and I would edit it. So we all have a process. And the other thing too is surround yourself with really, really productive people. I had this best friend, and we went to the library every day for 2 years. Some people can't write in the library, right? I come from a big family, one of those kids that used to do my homework on the kitchen table. And so knowing when your brain works the best, and stay positive, and just know that there's a reason why 1% of the population have a PhD. Just know that whether you're a researcher or a tenure track professor, and again, Chicano studies, if you look at Chicano studies from afar, what a brilliant response to 600 years of colonization. And we're interdisciplinary, right? We take different disciplines and we create our own philosophies, our own lenses, right? And so we do have, Chicano methodology, Chicano theories, right? And so again, and you're in the mix. Even to establish a Chicano PhD program in Albuquerque, it's an exciting field. And just on a very positive note, just so you know, even though the political atmosphere that we're in here in California, we are literally developing ethnic studies all along the state for community colleges because it's the law. So you guys remember when they shut down Raza studies in Tucson? That prompted the momentum to create an ethnic studies requirement in California. So again, like my grandma used to say, todo pasa, right? And hopefully we're in a real situation here, but hopefully we will be able to organize and like they did in Minneapolis. And so it's tough, but did I answer your question?
Yes, you absolutely did. I love your energy. I love your passion. My family is from a really small town in New Mexico, and I take a lot of pride and I take a lot of personal growth in terms of just all of the changes that have happened like in this generation for my family. So
Yeah, congratulations. And again, that concept of, hate to get all dorked out, but of self-determination. Self-determination, man. I remember when I was at UCSB, I went to this orientation, all the new PhD students. It was all white and like 3 people of color. And I remember them saying, look to your left, look to your right. And I was like, oh, hell no, I'm out of here. You know, the whole thing, or they won't be sitting next to you. I was just like, this is a done deal. I didn't really know what I was getting into, but you can't beat hard work. And if you could get someone that trains you as a scholar, George Lipsitz was heaven sent. And then Mario Garcia, I don't know if you guys have read Desert Immigrants. That's a really, really good book that is foundational. He's a historian and he was really into oral history. And he was like a senior professor in my department. So when the younger professors were trying to kick me out, he was backing me up. So, and I wasn't an innocent party. You know what I mean? I talked a lot of crap, but that's what we do. You know, I'm a working class Chicano from Oxnard, and so that's my expertise, is to talk shit. No, I'm joking. No, but I do. And then to be smart, I always want to, one of my things is always to be smart, you know, be as smart as you can. And what's my end product? What's your end product? Just, you know, dale gas, like they say in San Antonio, right? Are any of you going to NACCS in April?
I think a number of them are. Yeah.
Presenting there.
Oh, congratulations. And just go to whatever major scholars that you like. NACCS, one of the coolest things about NACCS is there's a lot of really, really good scholars that present.
One thing I just want to point out, because question about the prospectus is, in my experience, most graduate students, or when they get to this point, are planning a project which is huge. And your project entirely focuses in on one comedy troupe, the Chicano Secret Service. But when you look at it closely, it speaks to all these other things.
And just to be very honest with you all, I was very strategic. I utilized performance in Chicano Secret Service to reveal cultural politics of performance of the early 1990s. So that was very strategic, right? And then because that was, again, that working class aesthetic that was really, really important to me. You know, amongst all this oppression, we're still prospering and we're still laughing. And again, talking about being born in Satire. So I grew up with uncles and aunts. I used to have this aunt, they were really pretty ladies. My dad used to say stuff like, we may not be rich, but we look good, right? And so again, that Chicano style, that aesthetic, that's our power that you can't buy, you know what I mean? And again, it's a stance, you know what I mean? And it's a perspective.
One more question from Joseph, and
Awesome.
his will be the last. And Joseph is a cultural studies scholar. So go
Right
for
on.
it.
I wanted to go back a little bit to your method and just you talked about contradictions and stuff, and just wondering in your method as a participant.
Observe, participate.
Yes. And how do you negotiate through, because you're interviewing people that you worked with closely as well, who are members of the troupe and then others. But how do you manage and work through those contradictions from a sort of, it's ethnographic, but it's also autoethnographic. And I'm working kind of in that space of autoethnography and autohistoria and stuff like that. How you worked through those contradictions, negotiations of perspectives, and when you had differing perspectives, even amongst members, perhaps coming out in your interviews and such.
Well, I'll start off with, there's no such thing as objectivity, right? Because you cannot separate the mind from the heart. That being said, I try to be as honest as I can in regards to when I do my interviews. Like even within my comedy troupe, I'm sure y'all know him. He's kind of famous. One of the original members was Lalo Alcaraz, the cartoonist, and he left in 1994, right? And so then when he left, we became Mal Ojo, and then for 2 years, and then actually Elisa Facio from Colorado, she hired us and she said, Chicano Secret Service is a way better name than Mal Ojo, right? And so then she talked about how we had earned that political space. So anyway, we went back and took our name and we replaced Eduardo Lopez. And again, I think that you need to just take all the facts and be as honest as possible. But then again, no matter what, every academic, we amplify what we want to amplify. Like Chicano Power Movement, we all know that it was homophobic and there was aspects of it of being anti-woman. And so there's some writers that just totally focus in on that. And then there's other writers that are like, yeah, that's definitely true, but you can't disavow the entire movement. So again, I would just try to be as objective as possible. But again, even the way you design your questions, your lens, and I'm going to just say this, what is your end product? Like what was my end product? My end product was to reveal a hidden history and to show the world that, man, 1992, the LA riots, Pete Wilson, all these anti-Mexican Chicano initiatives, all this oppression, we're freaking kicking ass, man, on the daily. And that was the power of performance, even if it's just to subvert power, to turn power on its head. And this is for you, Joel. Even if it's just for a moment, you're emancipating people, right? To laugh at the king, to laugh at white supremacy ideology. And even one of my grandma's sayings, I grew up with a lot of violence and it would be going down. And my grandma would be like, that's all you got? You better come at me with more than that. And that's how I feel right now with Trump. That's all you got? And within those words, yeah, I am scared. I'm like, fuck, man. Like, this is no joke. We got to protect ourselves. Wrong place, wrong time. And so, did I answer your question? Yeah, so I would just be, and again, to be clever, it's your perspective, it's your stance, and to empower your narrative. That's your, what are you working on, Joseph? What?
I moved through a lot of sort of reading of cultural texts. Main focus of one chapter right now is definitely a boxing match that occurred between two local boxers in Albuquerque in the 90s, Tapia Romero fight, and looking at that and how that people read who is Mexican, who are Chicanos, who are especially in New Mexico, Spanish versus Mexican identity through that fight.
I love it. Good work, man. And then again, I just really love that concept from the bottom up, right? The subaltern can't speak because that's what we're doing, And so, wow, your work sounds really good. Look at Stuart Hall, identity. I love that concept of being. Identity is a concept that is never totally completed to be, but most importantly, what we can become. I use Stuart Hall a lot. Stuart Hall was really, a lot of his theories I was able to apply to Chicanos in regards to how they went into England and just where we're at too, So in regards to, just real quick, to the Chicano radical tradition, the major difference between the Bloc radical tradition, which I had to work through, was that we're indigenous. So that's one of my major concepts, is that, and we all know it, Mexicans are not immigrants. We are indigenous to the Southwest, right? But within the US legal system, we are treated as immigrants. Talk about contradictions, and then why are contradictions important? So that's a perfect example of working through that concept. So again, my advice to you all is, if you could get a scholar that could train you, whatever that means to you all, and then again, go to as many conferences as you can and talk to a lot of people. And the other thing too is, like, I don't think it's bad to mimic people. I had a friend, she was a filmmaker and she got her PhD at Stanford, and then she became a full-time professor at UC Santa Barbara, right? So I thought, dang, I could do that. I could be a professor and then just do my theater. So I perform like 2 or 3 times a year. And just so you know, every class that right now, there's been a paradigm shift in teaching and learning. So I'm doing hybrids, face-to-face, And I do a lot of online classes, late starts, right? And so right now, there's a lot of jobs in California in ethnic studies right now. So if any of you have a master's, I would start applying. That's my advice. I wish you all the best. You all are in a very, very good position. University of New Mexico, I think, is amazing. Albuquerque, no, I'm joking. You know, but when I go to Albuquerque, I'm like, Chihuahua, man. The houses are beige, the people are beige, the dirt is beige, your favorite colors, everything's beige. What's up with that? Except the chile, right? Chile adobada. Yeah, so when I go there after 2 days, I told my cousins, do you guys have sushi? They got all mad. You're tired of Chile? I'm like, yeah, I'm tired of that pinchy Chile, man. Yeah, I need some sushi or some Indian food or something. But anyways, peace.
And I think at this point, I'll just ask you all to give a round of applause for Dr. Carrasco.
All right.
Thank you.
Good luck with all your work. And always remember, you can't be
Absolutely.
hard work and you always got to look cute. No, I'm joking. No.